Let me. Hang on one second. Well, welcome everybody. Really appreciate you joining us. Let me see if I could pull up just a couple slides that I want to share with everybody as we get started. Today, our webinar is about animal fats and what can we do with these animal fats. And we are thrilled to have two experts in this area. We have Dr. Jennifer Martin, who is a professor of animal sciences at Colorado State University. And she spends a lot of her time working with people in this area, and she's very experienced in the animal protein and animal fat markets. We also have Nicole Ootman, who is the sales and marketing director and co-owner of Mountain View Meats in Fort Collins. So maybe you guys know them. They're fantastic. Just a couple things. If we can mute our microphones while our speakers are talking and presenting, this just helps eliminate some background noise. We welcome and encourage questions. Feel free to raise your hand or type them in the chat, and I'll be monitoring that. We'll make sure they're addressed. And of course, we'll be asking for questions throughout the webinar and even at the end. And don't hesitate, right? I mean, if you come up with something, let us know. And if you do come up with questions after the webinar, you can email me at barb.howe@state.co.us. And thank you for joining us. And I am going to turn it over to Dr. Martin to kick us off.
Thank you, Barb. I'm going to share my screen and give me just a second to get that going. And thanks everyone for joining us today. As Barb mentioned, this is a conversation we've been looking forward to having for some time, and a topic that comes up often, especially post the pandemic, and then even more recently, some of the emerging opportunities that live in this space of animal fats and how they might be marketed. I will note that I had a change in family scheduling, and so I'm at an airport, so I apologize if you do hear any background noise. I have all of the noise buffers on, so hopefully those background noises are minimized, but apologies if you do hear anything. But again, just looking forward this morning to share a bit about this space, some of the emerging markets and opportunities here, as well as some of the regulatory frameworks and challenges that are helpful for you all to know. I'm not sure what sectors each of you are coming from, or those of you who are viewing this afterwards. So I'm going to give a very brief overview to start us off, and then we'll save some time in the Q&A portion, especially following Nicole's presentation, when we can really dive in to some of the details, if you will. So let's go ahead and get started. When we think about producing animal carcasses, one of the questions that folks often don't acknowledge or don't think about is how much fat the animal carcass produces. And as you all know, if you're in the processing or livestock production space, the amount of external fat really has the greatest impact on carcass yield and reflects the amount of fat that that animal will produce, as well as the internal fat that's intended while the animal's alive to support the organs. But it really is that external carcass fat that influences yield and influences the amount of fat that we then have to do something with. About 20 to 35% of the total carcass weight, regardless of species, is fat and bone. And as you also know, if you're in the business of selling meats, from a relative value perspective, that fat and bone is worth much less money than the meat products themselves. So what happens to the fat after harvest? One of the things that we've seen over the past several decades in American consumers is they've really scrutinized the presence of visible fat in meat products that are available for purchase. The modern day meat cutting specifications call for very little visible fat on the retail meat products. And you'll actually see in some cases, there's devoid or no fat present on the retail cut. So what that means for those of you in the processing sector is that if we have carcasses with a large amount of external fat or lean fat, you have to remove that fat during processing and are then left with the question of what to do with the fat that you've removed during the processing process. The raw fat can be blended with proteins or sold directly to humans. It's important to note, though, raw fat that's intended for human consumption is held to the same inspection standards and requirements as meat products that are intended for human consumption. Or you may get in the habit of rendering fat Rendered fat, we'll talk about the rendering process here in just a second, can be used to produce cooking oils or cooking fats. It can be used in the cosmetic or home good industries. We also see a portion of rendered fats going into the pet food sector. The third part of what might happen with the fat is that we don't capitalize on the value that is in fat, and we actually move it into waste streams such as composting or landfill processes. So we're going to talk really on the part of the animal that we can generate value from versus those non-value components that usually, when we don't have options, we end up taking those fats to the landfill or to compost piles. So what is rendering? Essentially, rendering is high temperature cooking of animal fats and proteins to yield refined and value added materials. So we have rendered animal fat and rendered animal proteins. And many of you may do this process at home. I tell folks, if you cooked bacon, then you've rendered products, you've rendered meat products. So if you look at the two pictures, the picture on your left-hand side shows a very high-tech commercial rendering operation, whereas the picture there on the middle or the right-hand side is a home rendering operation where that fat is being exposed to really high temperatures in a stainless steel cooking vessel. But essentially, the rendering process is really straightforward. We take fat and other raw materials. We usually break them into smaller pieces so that they can be exposed more equitably to high temperatures. There's usually a combination of heat over a period of time, and that heat can be either wet heat or dry heat. After the heating process, you're then either going to remove the solids and separate the solids from the liquid portion of that rendered fat, or you're going to press them through a centrifuge to then help with the separation of those two. You'll separate out the protein, you'll separate out the fat, and there are other processes that can occur from there forward, whether that's clarifying of the fat, addition of other ingredients to the fat to help prolong the shelf life of the fat, and then further processing to yield valuable materials that can then be sold. So rendered animal fat. Rendered animal fat is deemed either edible or inedible. This is a really important distinction and something that we're going to take a bit of time to understand. So edible fat entails fat products that stem from the harvest of inspected animals that are intended for human consumption. But the edible fat designation really applies to where the rendering occurs. And so edible fat must be rendered in food grade facilities that are also under inspection by USDA. So think of it this way: if we have animals coming from USDA inspected facilities, those animals are in their products are intended for human consumption. And then we send the fat from those animals to a food grade federally inspected rendering facility. Only then can that fat from that rendering process be deemed edible. A couple of examples that are more commonly known would be beef tallow or pork lard. On the flip side, we have inedible fat. And inedible fat is fat and byproducts from the animal that are not intended for human consumption. So these products may go through a federally inspected or a USDA inspected meat processing facility, but the rendering facility itself does not have to operate under food grade or federal inspection. So a couple of examples there might be fats used in animal feeds. Choice white grease is an example of one of those, or products intended for cosmetics. So again, the key designation is whether or not these are intended for human consumption and the facility these rendered products are produced in, being a food grade facility or not a food grade facility. So what's next? Once we have now our rendered fats, what do we do with it? And so rendered fats have many, many uses. More commonly, most recently, we've heard of conversations around rendered animal fats being used again as cooking oil. So again, if you think about the history of cooking and food in the US, we saw a move away from the use of animal fats towards the use of synthetic fats for cooking. We've also seen a resurgence of the use of rendered animal fats in baking products. The use of rendered fats in animal feeds has been relatively consistent over time. And then again, more recently, a resurgence in the use of animal fats in cosmetics. So all of the pictures that you see there across your screen show the multiple different market opportunities that exist for rendered fats. But how they can be used depends on how they were produced. So there is a difference if we're talking about animal fats, rendered animal fats that can be used for tallow, cooking tallow, compared to rendered animal fats that are used for face cream. One of those requires the production in a USDA inspected facility, whereas the other does not. Let's talk about then what we can do. And we have a few scenarios that we'll work through, and again, save the bulk of time for Q&A, because this does get into the weeds a bit. And there's lots of variations depending on what type of processor or producer that you are. So if we ask ourselves, are you a custom exempt meat processor? And if the answer is no, we'll talk about what the other options are here in a second. But if the answer is yes, just like market access for the meat products from a custom exempt meat processor, there are some limitations on what you can do with fat that originates from these processing facilities. So if you are a custom meat processor, the simplest way to manage fat is to return the fat, the raw fat, back to the animal owner, just like you return the raw meat back to the animal owner. And that raw fat cannot be sold to other consumers beyond the person who owned the animal prior to harvest. Another thing that can happen is those custom exempt processors can provide a rendering service to the animal owner and then provide that rendered animal fat back to the owner of the animal alongside the fresh meat products and other products going to that animal owner. Let's say, though, that you're a federally inspected meat processor. So if you're a federally inspected meat processor, you can also sell the raw fats to consumers, not just the animal owner. So you can have fat in your storefront or in an online operation if you're a federally inspected processor. If you also happen to have, which is a pretty rare occurrence, if you also happen to have a food grade USDA inspected rendering capability on site, then you can produce rendered fats and sell rendered fats to consumers, just like you're selling inspected animal proteins or animal meat to consumers. If you do not have a rendering facility on site, you can also sell the raw fat, or you can use an inspected commercial kitchen to render that fat in an inspected commercial kitchen and sell it to consumers for other purposes. Too far. What if you're not a meat processor? And if you buy fat from a federally inspected meat processor, if you didn't do that, if you are an animal owner who sent your animal to a custom exempt meat processor, all that you can do is ask for that raw fat to be returned to you, and then you can home process that raw fat for your own use and consumption. You cannot sell the raw fats that you render at home from a custom exempt facility and sell it to your neighbors or friends or social media followers. But if you did buy animal fat from a federally inspected facility and you do have access to a commercial kitchen, you can sell rendered animal fats to consumers. If you do not have access to an inspected commercial kitchen, but you did buy fat from a federally inspected meat processor, your options are very similar to if you were to buy that fat if you were the owner of the animal and had your animal processed at a custom exempt processor. All that you can do without access to an inspected commercial kitchen is home render that fat for your personal use. So what if you want to take the fat that you have and make cosmetics such as face creams or home goods such as candles? A little difference versus meat products is that home goods and cosmetics are regulated by the Food and Drug Administration with assistance from states. So oftentimes the Food and Drug Administration delegates regulatory authority to the states to inspect and make sure that the guidance from the FDA is followed within the states themselves. So rendered animal fats for use in cosmetics and home goods should not contain any restricted materials. So it should not contain brain or spinal cord from the animal, regardless of if that is from a federally inspected facility or a custom exempt facility. Tallow for use in cosmetics should not contain more than 0.15% insoluble impurity. So this is a clarity or a standard that FDA has for the use of tallow in cosmetic goods. That regardless of if it's produced in a small or large facility, this standard must be met and maintained by anyone producing tallow for cosmetic purposes. It must also have a minimum melting point of 40 degrees Celsius. Additionally, processors who are looking to make cosmetics such as face cream or candles or other home goods should adhere to all and any state label regulations, and most importantly, must indicate that those goods, face creams, cosmetics, and home goods are not intended for consumption and are thereby not held to the same requirement for USDA inspection, only held to the requirement for FDA inspection or FDA regulation. A couple of resources, and I'm going to turn it over to Nicole to share her experience as a processor in our state who is trying to market fat and navigate some of the complexities that I just alluded to. And we'll share a few resources for you. The first of those is the custom exempt meat processing guidelines provided by the State Department of Agriculture as well as the CDPHE Cottage Food Acts. One of the things that we often hear is that the Cottage Food Act for Colorado allows for the direct marketing of tallow for the purposes of cooking oils. And it in fact does not. It is explicitly against the Cottage Food Acts to market tallow or other fat products for the purposes of cooking oils. So an important thing to take a look at if that's an interest that you might have. Another thing that I share often is FDA's guidance for cosmetic ingredients, which outlines their specifications for tallow and other animal fats that are often utilized for the cosmetic purposes. Now, again, FDA in our state has delegated regulatory authority and oversight to our state Department of Public Health and the state Department of Agriculture, but they rely on the guidance provided by FDA. A couple of other things I'll point out to you. The bottom left-hand side shows the USDA regional food business centers, of which Colorado State is a proud home of. The Regional Food Business Center often elevates the innovation and entrepreneurship, especially in these new market opportunities, such as the development of markets for rendered animal fats or rendering facilities perhaps themselves for Colorado and processors across the West. So I would encourage any of you who are interested in pursuing this market to consider applying for financial support from the Regional Food Business Center to help grow your business and also examine some of the resources that they have available for small food producers. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Nicole.
Oh, that was great. Does anybody have any questions for Dr. Martin? Maybe just one quick question. Where could a producer or somebody who, they have their fat, they just are thinking, hey, maybe I do want to make something with it. Where do they go to get impurity testing done, or what labs would you suggest that they contact?
That's a really great question. And that's something that there's not a wealth of labs that are easy to find, but there are some commercially available labs. I would suggest that any of our processors who are on the call either today or watching afterwards first contact CSU. We can do impurity testing in our lab, and I find that it's perhaps a much easier starting point to see what tests you need to perform before you jump maybe headfirst into a commercial lab. But there are a couple of commercial labs in Colorado. If you have a well-established testing plan and know what you're looking for, that can help you test for impurities. But I think CSU is a great place to start.
Yeah, that's a great resource. Anyway, they could, get some other feedback as well. So great. Well, thank you. I don't see any questions. So Nicole?
Yes. All right. Well, thank you for having this webinar and this topic. It's become very popular, and I appreciate you having a beef producer perspective on there. So a little background about me. I'm Nicole Utman. I am co-owner of Mountain View Meats. We currently have 3 generations that are working our beef operation. So I'm excited that my 2 sons are wanting to continue. They're the 6th generation of our ranch in Virginiadale. And in 2015, we decided to buy a feedlot in North Fort Collins so we could feed out our own cattle as well as feed other customers. And it was COVID, good old COVID, that forced us into selling direct to our community. We had had cattle scheduled to go to JBS, and they had shut down for 2 weeks while the virus ran through their employees. So we had a bunch of finished cattle and nowhere to go. That's when there was no meat in the grocery stores. So we got dozens and dozens of calls of people wanting to buy halves and wholes. And so that propelled us into selling direct to the consumer. The biggest bottleneck at that point was the packer. And in Fort Collins, they were 1 to 2 years booked out. So we found a processor in Craig that was willing to work with us, but they were 4 hours away and 2 mountain passes. So that wasn't convenient, but it worked at the time. And in the meantime, we found a couple in Wyoming that was wanting to put together a processing facility, and they wanted partners. So we joined up with them. And in December of 21, we opened Bear Mountain Beef, which is in Hawk Springs, Wyoming. It's a small processor. We process beef, hogs, goats, sheep, and an occasional water buffalo. And so that's been a blessing to have our own processing facility to kind of oversee. And then just listening to our customers, they wanted to just buy individual cuts. They just want to buy a steak here and there. So we opened our farm store on our property at the feed yard, and I'm only open a couple days a week, but it's been nice to have the public come in and just pick out and talk with them about what we do raising beef here in Colorado. With that, my passion in the last few years is trying to utilize more of our carcass. And having a small processing plant, we realized that we have a lot of byproducts that come off the carcasses. And at first we were taking them to the dump. And then we found a place to compost everything. And I've visited JBS a few times, and it's amazing how they can utilize the entire carcass. They have the facility and the labor and the money and the markets to find a place for the eyeballs and the hides and everything. But for small processors like us, we don't have those markets. We don't have the time, and we definitely don't have the labor to do that. So I've been looking in how can we market our own byproducts. And so for Mountain View Meats, as a customer of our processing facility, I keep all the fat, the trimming, and even the kidney and suet fat. I keep all the bones and sell for soup bones or dog bones. And then we keep all the organs, and the processor takes some of the organs and makes into a dog blend for us. But we try to keep as much as possible. And so with that, I do get about 20 to 30 pounds of probably beef fat from a carcass. We are grain and grass finished, so I get a little bit more fat on mine. And I do have a great market to sell my raw fat for people wanting to render it or make cosmetics out of it for their own businesses. And I sell the raw fat, and then I did start, at the request of some customers, making our own tallow lotions. And I have a friend who is making those in small batches for me, and we're marketing those. So that I'm just getting started in. But I'm looking into how to sell and render cooking tallow and bone broth. That's been a huge request from my customers. So I started looking into this about 1.5 years ago. And the first thing was, well, it'd be great if I could just render it under the Cottage Food Act while I was at home. But I contacted the Colorado Department of Health and Environment, and they said that meat products and meat byproducts are not under that act. So I could not do that. I needed to go to a commercial kitchen. So the second option I looked into was a commercial kitchens. And realizing how much time it takes to render fat, because I don't know if you've ever done that, but it does take a couple renderings. It's low and slow. And it would take a lot of time. It would take a lot of funding and supplies if the commercial kitchen didn't have what I needed, buying the jars, buying the labels. It was something that I kind of put on hold at that moment because I wasn't ready to do that. So option 3, I was taking a class through the Western Meat School Business Acceleration Program through Oregon State University. And they mentioned co-packers. I never knew what co-packers was. And so I started looking into that. The Colorado Department of Agriculture does have a list of co-packers in the state. So I started emailing them. I probably emailed 15 plus co-packers asking if they could render tallow for me and how that works. And 4 responded back saying that they are not USDA certified and they do not have the means to do that. So that was kind of a dead end for me. I did find a large co-packer in Denver that was able to render tallow. They're USDA certified, but they want a minimum of 1,500 pounds of beef fat for their batch. So I sent in some messages asking if we could go in as a group of ranchers, maybe 4 or 5 of us combine and make different labels. I asked what the cost would be, because maybe this isn't profitable for us to do this. And I haven't heard back from them. I'm probably too small of a fish for them to deal with. So that was a dead end. So option number 4, and this is probably where I'm going to pursue more is having our own facility in Hawk Springs be able to render the tallow. We're currently looking into what the requirements are. We'd have to put together a HACCP plan. We'd have to make a commercial kitchen space. And right now, the funding and the labor and the time is just limiting us because we'd have to build on or do something different to make that space. But that's where I'm probably going to lean, is seeing if my own processing facility can render that. So I know that there's some other ranchers out there that are getting the cooking tallow made. One is doing it through their own USDA facility. And then I know a handful of ranchers that are just doing it out of their kitchen. And I want to abide by the rules, and I want to get the proper regulations, just because the public needs to know that their food is safe, and that we need to reassure them that we're following the proper safety regulations and requirements. So if anyone ever has any ideas for me, or they want to collaborate, or if they want to just chat about it, I would love to join in and talk about it. So yeah, don't be afraid to reach out to me and talk. And so I thank you again for letting me share my story.
No, thank you for sharing your story. I think it's super important topic, right? I mean, there's a lot of co-products that come off these animals. And you're right. The large processors, they have markets. We, have international markets. We have domestic markets for everything. But boy, there's a lot of animals being processed in the smaller regional state facilities. So great. Does anybody have any questions or thoughts maybe on this topic at all?
One thing maybe, Barb, I would add is this Nicole's point about making sure that we're processing under regulations. And I know oftentimes, and we can have a whole separate webinar around regulatory burdens and challenges, especially for our small and mid-sized processors. But until we see reform of regulation, not operating under regulations is risky, not just for the individual processor, but for the state of Colorado. And we saw that come to fruition after the passing of the Ranch to Plate Act and some of the other things over the past 5 or 6 years. And we saw a lot of confusion among Colorado processors as to what the rules were and how they had changed. And that got really close to Colorado losing its ability to have a custom exempt meat processing program. And so while I understand the regulations can be cumbersome and costly and certainly confusing, one of the things that we try to do through CSU and alongside our partners at the state is help to answer questions so that we don't have processors who are operating out of compliance and then risk their ability to maintain their livelihood. And so I know I just want to highlight that because I don't think anyone likes the regulations or how complicated they are, but until we see some change, it's kind of what we're left with. And so we just want to extend that hand of let us help you understand them so that you're in compliance and not putting your companies or businesses at risk.
That's a good point to highlight. I think, we're so fortunate here in Colorado, but the United States to have such a safe food supply. We don't want people to ever question it, right? And there's regulations for a reason, but to your point, there are experts like yourself. Nicole has had to navigate these things. She is an expert that can help answer some questions, or at least just give you some guidance on where to go for more answers. Yeah, Jerry?
I'm a USDA inspected processor in Durango.
Great.
We do about 1,000 cattle a year. Half of those would be USDA inspected. In order to get together with other small producers and increase the scale of fat processing, in considering freezing fat and shipping it and storing it until you have a large enough batch to go through a bigger processor, what's the situation with rancidity, and is freezing and thawing an issue in the process, or does that work okay? I think we have some food distributors that run trucks in and out of Durango that generally leave empty, and we could probably send fat to the northern part of the state where I think there's more of a locus of that kind of processing.
Yeah, that's a really great question, Jerry. I will say that it does impact rancidity. So especially if we see freeze thaw cycles. So we know that once it's frozen and stays frozen, you're generally okay for a certain amount of time, but fats do oxidize or they do become rancid during that frozen storage. So it's not an infinite amount of time. But where we've seen more problems in that particular space, I think about some of our colleagues out on the West Coast where they have even less access to renderers than we do here in the mountain region. They saw lots of problems with during transportation, freeze thawing happening, and then loads of frozen or semi-frozen fats being rejected because of quality concerns. And so it's a possibility, certainly, yes, but I think there's an art to freezing fat that I don't think the average processor has not process average transporter has down well. And so one of the things that helps with that is the addition of antioxidants to fats, but then that is a whole other level of complexity. So a short answer to your question, it's not unrealistic. We do have colleagues across the country who've done that and can share some best practices, but it isn't necessarily a fail-safe method, especially if the frozen storage of that fat is not consistently frozen.
Thank you.
Yeah, good question. So that's a long way, but yeah.
I think it highlights though this larger access to renderers that we have. And so one of the things I would just highlight for our processors on the call is that the American Association of Meat Processors is working alongside the North American Rendering Association to identify where rendering deserts are in the US. And then once we know where they're at, how then we can either provide access to renderers or provide intermediates. So whether it's the aggregators, access to co-packers, or frozen storage facilities that can hold on to frozen fat until a rendering truck can pick it up or something to that effect. So for the processors, I would encourage you to engage with AMP and be a part of these ongoing conversations that they're having with the North American Rendering Association.
Jerry, what do you do today with the fat from those animals?
We are associated with a retail market that does rendering in there. They have a inspected kitchen and they are they have a retail exemption from USDA, so they can legally render in an inspected kitchen, and so they are selling it just in small plastic 8-ounce portions. Both they're doing some lard and more tallow, and then customers can decide, whether they want to do cosmetics or food, either one with that.
Sure.
And that's working. We are straining the protein out of the rendered tallow and giving that to a animal shelter, a no-kill dog shelter, and that seems to be pretty good feed for them, actually. We do use some trim that has some meat in it that way, and are able to get, I think, a fairly clear product and still do something with that protein as well. We're not getting any of the money out of the protein, but at least we're not hauling it to the dump.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, a fair amount of it does go to the landfill at this point, and just like Nicole, I'm wanting to see if we can improve on that part of the process.
Yeah. Good points.
I do think we're seeing more and more. So you mentioned the selling of the protein fraction, or not selling, just the donation of the protein fraction. We are seeing more and more Colorado pet food manufacturers and who are looking to source Colorado proteins as well as fat. So again, just for those of you who were federally inspected processors who are looking for markets. I 2 or 3 times a week, I'll get requests from pet food manufacturers in the state who are looking to source Colorado grown and harvested proteins. One of the challenges, and this kind of speaks to Nicole's point, is volume and consistent supply of volume. And so I think, maybe an opportunity for us to continue having is how we can, to Nicole's earlier comment, pool supplies. So pool fat or pool organ meats, whatever it may be, that even if the market accesses a Colorado producer or processor, they still want to have a volume that they can rely on and consistency. So I think we're starting to see some other markets begin to expand in ways that have been pretty small in the past, and that may be an opportunity to think about in the future.
I guess I'd like to ask if that protein fraction could be just marketed directly out of the freezer case, the same as we do the tallow, for
Yeah,
pet
great.
food. Would consumers buy that?
Great question. So I wish I could give you a straightforward answer. My guess is yes, consumers would buy it. Regulation though of pet food and pet food labeling, it depends on if it offers nutritional value. So if it's not offering nutritional value and it's a treat, for example, that's a much easier pathway than if you need to market it for a pet food. So depending on what you think where it lives, then I think that's certainly something we see. I think about if you go to your local pet market, meal toppers are really, really common, and they're high concentrated, usually dehydrated proteins. I think there's certainly a market for things like that, but it depends on if it's a ration or if it's a supplement or treat that would depict which pathway you'd have to go down.
Yeah, years ago we looked into pet food, and you're right, it can get very, very difficult. I came away thinking that a ration was probably more difficult for regulation than meat for human consumption.
It absolutely is.
Really got deep fast.
It absolutely is. And I'm going to share a link in the chat, and maybe Barb, we can share it with the recording. But AAFCO, which is the Association of American Feed Control Officials, they have a really helpful resource. It's kind of a decision tree for anyone thinking of marketing their protein or fat from a pet food perspective. It helps you understand, is it a ration? Is it a treat? We've seen lots of Colorado meat processors who are turning, and some of you on the call and watching may be turning your bones or your hides into pet treats. That's a much, much easier path than if you're trying to formulate a pet ration or something that has specific nutritional claims. The part you're talking about, Jerry, I could see that being marketed as a high protein, maybe meal topper. That would put it in the ration category compared to the treat category. So we see more and more of our small and mid-sized processors taking the realm of let's market treats versus rations because of the complexities that you've mentioned. But this resource from AAFCO is helpful for anyone kind of figuring out where they might sit in the pet food space.
Something else we do is we put organ meats in what we're labeling as doggy grind, but it is it's basically sold right alongside hamburger, and we do have quite a few customers who take it home for human consumption, even though it's labeled for dogs. They know it's produced the same way. We throw different organ meats in there, and that's not part of this fat conversation, but it has worked out very well.
That's such a growing market. I wonder, Nicole, or would you share, especially for the folks about maybe customers that are buying raw fats to blend, or are you guys blending any raw fat with maybe some of your leaner animals to produce grinds?
Yeah, we're not adding fat to any of our ground beef. So I just get the trim back. I do ground the kidney fat so it renders easier and it looks different than the trim fat. And I'm just selling it frozen, vacuum sealed to people. And I also keep the pork as well and do that as so. I do get people who will buy the raw fat for their tallow business, or they're just mixing it in with their game, and or they're rendering it for a cooking home cooking. So, if I have one more question for Jennifer, if she leaves.
Yeah.
So if I go through a commercial kitchen, does that need to be USDA inspected too? If I want to render my fat through myself?
It's a retail exemption.
Of retail, okay.
And I believe, Barb, you may know this more so than I believe CDA has a list of the commercial kitchens on their website for folks, just to help people identify where they're at.
You are correct. And I think Nicole actually accessed that, but yeah, I can put that when we, I can pull that up and put that in our chat as well.
Yeah, I know there's one for co-packers. I didn't know if there was
Yeah.
one for commercial kitchens.
It's a good question. They're kind of together, but yeah, and we're working on making it a little more searchable. Like I'm ready to put up an Excel sheet, if you will, where you can search by what it is, like maybe what they're making or can make, and location, because that's a big one. You know, you might find somebody that's really far away from you, but yep, let me pull that up. Well, I mean, Nicole, what other tips would you have for somebody who, might be wanting to get started in this area, or kind of, like what kind of questions did you come up with as you navigated this whole thing? Because you've done a fantastic job in finding a lot of answers, and I know some more questions, but what tips would you give maybe Colorado Proud members that might be thinking about this?
Yeah, I don't know that I have the answers because I'm still trying to work on my own cooking tallow to sell direct to the public. But if you wanted to go down the tallow lotions and soaps, just starting to research it. How do you render tallow the best way? I spent a lot of time looking at people's YouTube videos because there is a way to render tallow so that it is more pure and it lasts longer. Because if you just do one rendering, a lot of times that doesn't last. I've also talked to someone through a product development specialist at the Oregon State University, and she was telling me about figuring out a shelf life for your product. And it's something that I could go through like CSU or CSU Spur, or I could do it myself where you set it out and you just keep a log of how long does this stay before it goes rancid. And so just a lot of research is where I got started, and connecting with other people that are doing the same thing, asking a lot of questions.
Yeah. Sorry, I lost it for a second. Yeah. No, and I think that's good. That's really good advice. And I know, hopefully if somebody reaches out to you, I know you'd probably be very kind and at least guiding them somewhere and saying this works or this doesn't work. No, that's really good. I think it's something we all wonder about, what do we do with all of this stuff? Personally, I get requests all the time from my beef customers. They want the hides. They want certain things. And I'm like, the processor we utilize doesn't, it's hard to get those things back. And I don't know that everybody understands the condition they may get them in. So.
One of the things that Nicole mentioned that I would highlight too is just finding out which fat renders best. The internal fat, so the kidney fat, tends to be pure because it has less connective tissue and less protein. And so for those people who are doing it at home, saving yourself, like separating fat by quality, and quality meaning if you're rendering it, what's going to, what's going to have the best melting point, what's going to have the least impurities. The internal fat seems to be better. And so if you're sorting fat in your processing facility, try to keep that fat separate from the external fat that comes off when you're fabricating.
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, I know Dr. Martin's going to have to jump on a plane here in a few minutes. Does anybody have any last minute quick questions for her? We certainly, Nicole can answer questions as well, but does anybody have anything for Jennifer that you could address?
There's
Well,
a
we can't
couple of
thank you
times
enough.
that rendering or composting has been mentioned.
Mhm.
I certainly have not tried composting fat. Composting guts and blood and meat seems hard enough. But I am interested in any research being done or any techniques. I bought a tub grinder to throw all the viscera and into, and I'm using wood, various wood sawdust and chips and different sources of wood to make some compost, and I'm doing reasonably at it. Each batch smells a little bit less than the previous one did, but I'm quite interested in any resources or experience in rendering.
I'll share some of the research that we've done here on composting fat, as well as some of our colleagues out on the West Coast. Just again, because their access to landfills and or rendering facilities is so low that they've done a lot. So I'll share some of that. Maybe Barb can send out to the group.
Yeah, I
It's
sure can.
not as good as when you're composting proteins or organ meats, but there are some tricks that they've learned that seem to help.
Great.
That's a good question. Well, Dr. Martin, thank you so much for your time today. Great resources as always. And thank you for doing that with us.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.
And Nicole, any last words you want to share? You did a fantastic job. Thank you for telling us so much about what you're doing and how you got there. I think it's neat. I mean, COVID was it helped some people and, it hurts a lot of people, but I think there were ways out of it for processors found a way.
No, thanks for having me on here. I'd love to, learn more about how we can, work together as a state to try to utilize more of the carcass and get some more resources in place. So yeah, definitely reach out if you guys ever have an idea.
Well, thank you so much. Jerry, any other questions? Thank you for such great questions and engaging with us. Really good questions.
No, I think that's probably all I can hold in my head today. I do appreciate all of you for the efforts that you've put forth there.
Well, and I'll get your email from your Zoom registration, and I will send out some links that Jennifer mentioned. And if that helps you, with the composting idea, because, yeah, I imagine we got to think of all the different ways to get rid of the stuff, to utilize it. So
Thank you.
Well, thanks, you guys. Our next webinar will be June 23rd, and we're going to be talking with ag technology entrepreneurs, and that's going to be really exciting. They're going to tell us what they're doing. We have people that are, managing irrigation via satellites. Very interesting stuff. So we're going to be talking with them, and hopefully some folks can join us. Thanks so much.
Thank you.